Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatirons Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatirons.tuning.com and stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning. Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Flatirons Motorsports Podcast. I think this is episode 103, believe it or not.
Wow.
And we have got Mike Pettiford from Go For It Services, Go For It Racing, joining us. And Mike, you were in the shop the other day, and we talked about some topics. And one of the things that was on your mind to talk about was safety. And
Always.
yeah, and that is something that, like, in the community, it pops up every now and then, and usually where it comes up is if there's an incident, something happens in an event, obviously where something goes, maybe not as much to plan as we would hope, that
Or
it
or maybe there was like an accident on I-70 that involved 9 semis and 12 cars
well, then there's that also. Yes, safety
yesterday.
is one of those things where it usually is not on top of mind unless something has happened to put it there. But
Sadly true.
yes, but it's one of those things where it is good to maybe every now and then think about our setup, our equipment, the choices that we're making as far as, like, what degree of safety we have, and those sorts of things. So I thought that was a great topic, and well, here we are to talk about it. Maybe
Sure.
maybe just as a primer for anybody that's not seen, Mike's been a guest on the podcast a number of times, but maybe for anybody that's not familiar, maybe can you give an idea of your background with driving and motorsports? Do you have an idea of how much experience you might have with this subject?
Well, let's see. I started Go For It Services 38 years ago now. And we do safety training for cars, motorcycles, trucks, buses, RVs. We have a racing team for cars. We do licensing for racing for cars and motorcycles. We also do corporate events. We do big corporate charity events where we have as many as 125 people per day at a racetrack. And then I do behind the wheel instruction. So I've got a pretty broad background in car, motorcycle, truck, bus, RV type safety and performance issues,
And
as you
and
well
racing.
know.
You can't forget about the
And
racing part. So you also race yourself.
right, won 53 championships, amateur championships with SCCA, divisional, national, or mid-states conference championships, which is more than anybody else in history.
And this is road racing, just to
Road
clarify that.
racing. Yeah,
So, and in all of that, all those years of racing, I'm guessing that there's been a time or two, maybe just a time or two, where you've had to put a couple wheels off, or you've had an incident. So you've kind of, I mean, is that fair to say you've been on the experience end of that as well?
sure.
Unfortunately, but yeah.
Unfortunately, yes. Let's see. When I was road racing motorcycles, I was doing a class, and I actually fell down on the motorcycle at over 100 miles an hour.
Oof.
That
That's
was that was not as much fun as everybody says it is.
I'm not sure they say it's that much fun. But that's where the gear and in the preparation and some of the decisions made ahead of time really start to pay dividends.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I like to tell people, because motorcyclists kind of get a bad gig at parties and social events, you always get, I'm usually the one that rides the motorcycle, and then that's when the horrendously bad stories come out.
Right.
Yeah, my brother Fred had a motorcycle and he's now missing one arm, and there's
Yeah.
never good stories.
Right.
So here's a good story. I road raced motorcycles for almost 40 years, never broke a bone. There you go.
Wow.
And I went pretty fast.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is maybe a good segue into what I've heard you talk about before is an awareness plan, which is maybe a good place to start when you're talking
Sure,
about safety and
sure.
you're on track. And so maybe let's just jump into that first. So Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, when we're doing a class, and what you're referring to, I think when you did a class with me ages ago now, hint hint,
Mhm.
was the awareness plan. And this is the way that you can tell if you're about to lose control of your car. The top drivers in the world can go to any track, get in any car in any conditions, and go amazingly fast and not crash the car. So the $100 question is, how do they do that?
Mhm.
Well, when you're in plan A of the awareness plans, you're driving perfectly. Okay. You're hitting your apexes, your turn in, your exits, your speed going into the turn in point is correct. It's perfect driving. And we all aspire to do that, but in reality, there are no perfect drivers. Even Lewis Hamilton makes mistakes every now and then. So plan B is if, let's say, you go into the corner a little fast, and instead of being all the way over to the left, you're over to the right a little bit. So now there's no way that the car is going to track the way that it normally does. And you'll feel that the objective is to correct that by the apex. Then you can go back to power. You've lost a little bit of time, but not that much. Plan C is if you, these get worse and worse, as you're
Yes.
well aware.
Yes.
Plan C is if you go even faster and you cut the corner even shorter. Now, through your best efforts, you're not going to hit the apex. Your objective now is to stay on the track. Okay.
Right.
And now you've lost a huge amount of time. If you were in a race, 2 to 5 people would be passing you. One of them would wave to you, and you've made a pretty bad mistake. Plan D is if you go in even hotter and you don't realize it soon enough. Now you're going to go off the track. The objective is to keep the car upright. And what
Mhm.
I mean by upright is if you are sliding and you go off the track, the outside wheels can dig in and you can roll any car, even a
Yep.
Formula car, if you hit it just right. So the objective here is to go off as straight as you can, because if you're going straighter than you're going sideways, you're not going to roll the car. And
Right.
that's a good thing. Plan E is to don't hit anything solid if you have a choice.
Right.
By this time, you probably don't have a choice. But if you do have a choice, and this is the weird part, you want to go in nose first, because
Right.
that's where the car is going to protect you the most. It has the most amount of crumple zones. It's going to dissipate the most amount of energy. So even though the car will get hurt, you will probably not get hurt because the car has taken the bullet for you, if you will.
Right.
And then plan F, just use your imagination.
Yeah.
If none of those work,
Yes. Well,
you're
and
pretty
and
well screwed.
and the biggest point there, I think, is a starting point is the kind of the realization, or basically the knowledge that as soon as you go, say, like 2 or especially 4 wheels off, like in terms of safety, your priorities should shift to, safety for yourself, like to the car, for the car to an extent, but really, like, try and keep the car upright, try and avoid any obstacles. Obviously you don't want to hit anything, and if you have the ability to avoid that, well, definitely use that. But I think maybe one of the ways that we can get ourselves into trouble just in that first incident of just going off is to not switch our mental gear into that, and instead try and keep our brains in the track. Like, I'm going to keep on the throttle. I'm going to try and keep as much speed as I can. I'm going to try and get back on the track so I don't whatever. It's like that can actually be, like, from the start, how you can actually get yourself into a worse situation than if you completely
Well,
switch gears and focus on the situation that you're in.
and one of the things I say in my talk, as you'll remember, is we never drive below plan B.
Right.
Okay. So as soon as you start missing your apex, as soon as you go in and the car feels differently, fix it. Fix
Right.
it at the plan B level, and then you'll never have a problem going off the track and hitting something, or even losing control of the car, unless there's a pretty serious mechanical failure.
Right. And the big thing there is just again that like when something happens, like because unforeseen things can happen. Something happens, somebody taps you, you have a mechanical issue that ends up putting you off the track. How you handle that situation to a certain extent can have a big impact on how significant or how detrimental the end result of that is. And so I think just right at the top, you can put all the safety gear on that you want, but if you don't, it's also worth realizing or remembering that how you handle that situation is just as important as all the gear that you have on or whatnot too.
Well, yeah, I mean, the objective is to not ever lose control of the car
Right.
and to compensate for any other bad drivers, or sometimes stuff just happens in a race, and many times stuff just happens on the street. The street is even more risky, although the speeds are lower.
Right. Right. Well, because not everybody is necessarily playing by the same set of rules. Yes. Well, and
Yeah.
that's where, kind of like from a motorcycle standpoint, that's where awareness, paying attention to things, that is a big part of just normal driving safety. But it pertains on the track just as much as it would on the street.
Yeah, and one of the advantages that motorcycles have is they can avoid accidents even better than cars if the rider is good and paying attention, because they take up less space. I've been riding a motorcycle, and because I could go from behind the car to between the cars, I was able to avoid a potential accident. Whereas if I was in a regular car, I wouldn't have had that option.
Right.
Obviously motorcycles are more risky if you get hit because you don't have metal around you.
Right. Right. So it's a balance there certainly, but yeah,
Right.
paying attention and being able to take whatever action that you can is helpful to the best of your ability, no matter what you're riding or driving at the time.
Yep.
Well, so
And motorcycles as well typically have better performance than cars.
right.
So if you were to pull out in front of a car, like on a two-way stop on a highway, you should be able to accelerate, out accelerate the car and still avoid the accident.
Sure. And sometimes outmaneuver the car depending.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about gear because I mean, gear is one of those things where kind of like the motorcycle situation where you have to put the car or put the bike down. In that instance, you have no choices as far as what you may or may not have on at that moment.
Right.
And so, like if you're on a motorcycle, it's probably a more obvious and a more deliberate choice, versus like a car if you're driving at a track on a track day. But what is your thought as far as the prioritization of safety gear is? Obviously helmets, probably no matter what the circumstance. But as far as anything else like gloves, driving suit, etc.
Right. Well, if you're gonna ride a motorcycle, you want to have over the ankle shoes or boots, long pants, long sleeve shirt or jacket, gloves, and a full face helmet. A 3/4 helmet, which covers your ears and not the front of your face.
Right.
I mean, I used to not require a full face helmet when I first started my school, and I had a lady fall down in the gravel at very low speed, and she landed directly on her chin.
Hmm.
So from that moment on, I mean, I require it. If you're going to take my classes, you've got to have full gear. If I'm even going to test you, you've got to have full gear if you want me to do it. Now, technically, we don't have a helmet law in Colorado, so all you have to have is eye protection by law.
Wow.
But if you want to be tested by Go For It, you got to have full gear. That's the way we roll.
Sure. What about in a car? Because cars are one of those things where we take our safety a bit more for granted, just because we're kind of more encapsulated than on a motorcycle where we feel more exposed.
Yeah, I mean with cars, we've got 3-point seat belts, which aren't particularly great. I mean, in racing, we have 6-point seat belts, which are really great.
Mhm.
We have racing seats, which are very stiff. If you get rear-ended or you back into something, your seat isn't going to break and go backwards. That's happened to me when I was in Road Atlanta racing Camaros. This was forever ago. I was Vince the test dummy.
Oh no.
That after I had my accident and got my bell rung a little bit because the stock seat, which in showroom stock GT, you couldn't have a racing seat. It was against
Okay.
the rules.
Okay.
Well, after Vince, the test dummy, did his thing, they changed the rule. So now you have to have 6-point belts. You have to have a racing seat. You've got to have a window net, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah. Well, and
the thing with cars is it's safety is always relevant to what's the probability that something's going to happen, and then if it does happen, what are the consequences? So most people in cars never think it's going to happen to them. So if they put on their seatbelt, I mean, I just countless number of people that I instruct, I have to tell them to get the stuff off of the dash.
mhm,
They've got pins up there, stuff that can, if they were in an emergency, even just an emergency maneuver with high G forces, that stuff could fly around and impale them.
sure.
And a lot of them, very smart, very conscientious people, they just don't put two and two together that anything that's loose in your car can be a projectile,
Right.
and that's not a good thing.
And that's why a lot of tracks require that any non-essential anything is removed from the car before you go on track.
Right. And of course in racing, you wouldn't have any of that stuff. It would be ludicrous
Right.
because
Why would you add extra weight?
well,
But
extra weight, but
yeah,
why would you have a pin sticking through your helmet,
yeah.
when you were just cruising around?
Well, but for track days, if you're going to a track day, I mean, taking all non-essential stuff out of the car, you're probably going to have to do it at the track anyway. Why not do it in the garage before you leave?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Why not check the car over so that when you get to the track, you've got nothing to do but have fun with the vehicle.
right. And driving a car on track, I mean, a helmet is basically required everywhere for all the obvious safety reasons.
Right. And just let's see, for most of the tracks, 3/4 helmets are still okay. And I'm okay with that in cars. You're going to have less of a probability, especially if you have 6-point belts, then I don't think you can hit your head on the dash if they're
Right.
tightened up properly. Um, and then full face helmet, of course, if you're going to do pro racing, I would you have to have a full face helmet. You have to have a Hans device. You have to have a fire suit, fireproof underwear, socks, gloves, shoes, all of those things.
Yeah. Would you say like, if you've been going to the track and you're starting to really like want to make sure that that's an activity that you're going to do a number of times and you want to buy a helmet, it's probably best to buy, I mean, in my opinion, a full face helmet because like I said, some racing series require it. And if you're going to spend your money on a helmet, why not get one that you're definitely going to be able to use versus like if you get one that's maybe a 3/4 helmet, but then if you decide a year later, 2 years later to go racing, now you have to buy another helmet because the racing series requires a full face.
Sure, and you're gonna eventually have to update your helmet.
Mhm.
SCCA and the other racing organizations have standards for helmets. I think the standard now is 2015
Mhm.
SA, um, which means you can have a fairly old helmet, but if you've got like a over a 10-year-old helmet, you probably want to get a new helmet.
Yeah.
the straps, especially if you've been wearing it a long time, they can deteriorate, and that's very important.
Can you talk a little bit about what the difference is, safety-wise, between a motorcycle certified helmet and an automotive certified helmet?
Sure. They are, I mean, as far as impact protection, they're about the same. The motorcycle helmets are geared a little bit more for a big impact, whereas the car helmets are designed for multiple lesser impacts because you're in the vehicle. The SA stands for special application, and that just means that inside of the helmet, you've got a Nomex material that is fire resistant for the cars. Motorcycles, it's not an issue. If you fall down on a motorcycle, you're probably not going to burn because you're going to be away from the motorcycle.
Right. That's a big consideration, and that's one of those things that I think is overlooked. I mean, motorcycle helmets are less expensive; they're more readily available, and most tracks and organizations will allow it. But again,
Sure.
if you're going to buy a helmet and you think there's any chance that you might do any kind of motorsports, getting an automotive certified helmet versus a motorcycle certified helmet again means that like it's going to meet the right certifications if you want to progress.
Right.
And that fire prevention, that's a nice, it's good to know that you've got it versus not.
Yeah, because the chances of you being trapped in a car that's burning obviously is much higher in a car than, I mean, even if the motorcycle catches fire, 99% of the time, you're not going to be right on top of the bike. And if
Right.
you are, you're going to be conscious and you'll be off that bike in a New York minute.
Right. What do you think? You mentioned the Hans device. So maybe
Right.
just so this is for cars. Can you just briefly explain what a Hans device is and how they, like why you would want one?
Sure. Head and neck support is what Hans stands for. And the reason that Hans became popular, and I remember when we didn't have to have Hans, you would have someone that would get into typically a frontal impact, and right below their neck, their spinal cord would be either impaled or broken. And they would either be paralyzed or in some cases just die. And the reason is because your head, which weighs a fair amount, it doesn't have a seatbelt. Your
Right.
body has a seatbelt. So if you get into a really big frontal impact, your body is going to be held, but there's nothing to hold your head. And if your head really flexes or goes back far enough, there's going to be an injury. And when Hans devices first came out, they were like $1,500. And
Right.
I had to ask myself, look, pal, is your head really worth $1,500? And of course, you see the videos, and yes.
Then you go, yeah, it is.
Pay the man, yes.
Right.
But people didn't realize that if you can tether your head, which is exactly what the Hans device does, and there's other manufacturers other than Hans, but they all do basically the same thing. Now you've got a seat belt for your head, so that here we'll go sideways, so that instead of your neck falling all the way down and further, your head's going to stay pretty much level, and it'll move a little bit, but then
Hans
it'll be
catches.
tethered by the Hans device. And that can literally save your life or keep you from being paralyzed. So just pay the man. And you can get them. I've seen them as low as like $700, so.
And it goes it's almost like a collar. So it comes down on around your back. It's got like a bumper behind the helmet.
Right.
And then it comes down over your shoulders, and then that's connected directly to the helmet. So that's how your head movement is limited.
And it's held by the 6-point harness, so it's not going anywhere. And it's important to get the tethers adjusted properly. You don't want them to be too loose, and then you don't want them to be too tight either, because then you can't can't
Right.
move your head as much as you could. So
So, and you mentioned this 6-point harness, and so where that is relevant to it is like the Hans device that comes over your shoulders, and then the straps for the harness go over that. So the harness in part is holding the Hans in place for it.
right.
So that's where the support comes from.
In other words, you'd have to put the Hans on first and then put the straps over the Hans to anchor it. And then what I do is just make sure that the Hans is all the way back and, make sure that, okay, it's adjusted properly. It's as comfortable as it can be, but you still want it to be effective.
Right. Now, for a lot of racing series, they require that kind of neck protection. But for like track days, I don't think most of them require it because, again, you do have to have the racing harness to make the neck support work.
Right. If you just have a regular 3-point seat belt, yeah, there's really no place to put
there's no, like the one belt that comes across, there's not enough support there to onto the helmet. But generally speaking, and this is generally, if it's not a race car, if it's not a high performance car, the speeds are going to be a bit less. The chance, and you're almost certainly not going wheel to wheel. So like the probability of having an accident where, the Hans would really come into play is going to be less. But, for folks out there, it's something to be aware of.
Right. And, when you're out on a test day, or a practice day, there's no racing. Hopefully, people would be a little bit more polite and point you by, even if you're in a slower car. And this is where it gets hard. You've got your brand new Porsche, and this guy in this silly little Miata keeps closing you up. and you're supposed to point him by, but that's hard to do sometimes. And I've been in both of those types of cars, and if you're the little engine that could, you just keep hounding them, and eventually, hopefully, they'll point you by.
Right. So this brings us to an interesting point, which is harnesses, really, because that has gotten kind of, for good reasons, but it's gotten a little bit more complicated in the last couple of years because of, well, basically 4-point harnesses are pretty much not allowed anymore at any tracks.
Right.
And then there is the rule of equal protection for both passengers in the car, which has come about recently. And I would assume that, well, because you've been an instructor for so many years, I wonder, can you explain what brought about that rule about equal protection for both passengers, the driver and the passenger?
Sure. I mean, it's just to reduce the risk. A lot of the tracks, typically what will happen is somebody will have a crash and somebody will be injured. Okay. Either the driver or the passenger or both. And in retrospect, could it have been prevented if the safety equipment was at a higher level? And the answer is typically yes. Now, the other side of that coin is you've got hundreds of people that will come out to a track day. Most of them have no interest in actually racing. They just want to go out and have fun with their car.
Right.
And if you make it too difficult for them to do that, then you're going to lose them. Like if you were to require, a full roll cage, racing seat, fire system, you're going to lose a lot of people. And again, in most cases, there's not a lot of crashes, on a lapping day.
Right.
So the risk is of course there, but fairly small. I'm kind of surprised that they outlawed 4-place belts just because of, no submarine action.
Right.
And I get that, but a 4-place belt is still better than a 3-place belt.
In a factory retracting 3-point belt.
Yeah, sure.
So let's just say
rule.
Let's just say when we're talking about points, so the points are basically, you have, the belt system. The points are the number of places on the car that it's connected to.
Yeah, the attachment point.
Yeah. So like if you sit in your car and you pull your seatbelt on and you
Right.
clip it, well, that's one buckle. But if you look over your shoulder, that's one connection point to the car,
Right.
and then the lap belt on either side, that's a connection point on either side.
Right.
So that's your 3 points.
Right.
So 4 points is basically a connection over both shoulders, and then
Yeah.
you have a belt that
Around
goes
your
basically,
waist.
yeah, and then the 5 or the 6 point is between your legs so that your body can't slide out from under the harness.
Right. And go underneath the dash. And
Right.
the difference between the 5 point belt and the 6 point belt is just you have two submarine belts, more equally distributing the force on your
Right.
legs as opposed to turning
It's
you
just
into
one.
a soprano.
Right. So, and it's one of those things where there's a difference between driving at the track for fun, driving at the track to learn, and then being in a competition environment.
Right.
And so that's really like where the requirements for the tracks or the organizing body, typically that's where the difference is as far as how much gear do you have to have. Where do you have to have a racing harness, helmet, and a Hans versus you're allowed on track with just a factory seat belt.
Right.
And it's one of those things, like as you progress more, like if you get out to the track, like I said, the barrier for entry, they want to keep it reasonable so that if people want to just try it for the first time or explore it, you can do so in your car and you don't have to put thousands of dollars of safety gear into the car to do it. But then once you get to that competition level, then that's where, okay, well, the chances of something going a little bit haywire are greater. And so that's where the safety standards have to increase.
Right. And any time you've gotten a road racing license and you're racing, sanctioned racing wheel to wheel, again, not autocross, not time, excuse me, time attack. Those are types of competition, but they're not wheel to wheel racing. If you're going to go wheel to wheel racing, every organization that I'm aware of, you have to have a full roll cage, you have to have a racing seat, 6 point belts, window net, full protective gear, like we talked about, fire suit, et cetera, and either a fire extinguisher or a fire system, depending on the class and the car.
Right.
Some cars also have to have fuel cells. In the touring class that I race in, the stock gas tanks are acceptable.
And the factory gas tanks, they typically have to pass some kind of puncture resistance. I mean, for a production car to have a gas tank, there's tests that they have to go through.
Right. I mean, I feel very safe. I mean, it's possible to puncture either one. It's possible to have a fire in either one. I mean, we've all seen videos of really high level race cars with a fuel cell that got punctured just in the right way at a
Right.
high enough speed to cause ignition. So,
It's a probability game.
right,
It's again, it's like think of yourself in that situation where you're riding the motorcycle and then something happens and you're in the process of falling down. Well, if you can think of that scenario, the more stuff that you can put on, you give yourself a better chance of being less injured, greater
right,
survivability chance in that circumstance. And that's where those racing sanctioning bodies, they have all those standards in place for good reason.
right.
Now,
Well, and I can tell you from personal experience, when I fell down at 100 miles an hour, you slide a long way, buddy.
sure.
And at the end, when I finally stopped, I got up, I checked myself out, nothing broken, brushed myself off, picked up my motorcycle,
Right.
which was kind of a paper wad.
And you were
And,
very glad to have done it.
yeah,
And had all the gear so that you could like get up in that situation.
absolutely.
One of the things that's hard, I think, is to know where minimum requirements are okay and where even if you're not required to have a higher standard of safety gear, where maybe you want to bring or basically install a higher level of safety gear even if it's not required. Do you have any kind of thoughts in that regard?
I do. It really depends on how serious you want to be. In other words, if you don't mind being really polite, like, if somebody comes up behind you, you put on your turn signal or point them by, and you do that, when you see them. So there's never a confrontation, then your risk is going to be pretty low.
Which
People
which
are,
would that would be the circumstance basically at a normal track day. Like it's not a
well,
competition to
that
an
would
extent.
be, yeah, that would be for some people.
Right. True.
Most people, I would say, are in the middle,
Okay.
where they're not going to be that polite, but if an aggressive driver comes up on them, with authority, then they'll be in the middle ground.
Hmm.
Like, it's that guy again, Pettiford.
Right. Just give them the point by and
just,
get on with your
just,
day.
just get it over with. That's right.
Right.
Now, at the top level, the people that really want to be top drivers and top racers, then you're going to have to, be really good at racecraft. And sometimes that's going to involve, light rubbing or the potential of contact. And if you're in that category, then I would say yes,
Yeah.
get all the safety equipment. Go ahead, get started in racing. You might as well, because you're only going to be so good without racing.
Well, and kind of what I'm getting from the first part of that is like focus. Like if you have a really hyper focus on going fast and you want to push, again, you're maybe not going to be driving in your mirrors as much, and you really want to go fast and you really want to push and develop, and always like going faster is the top priority. That might be a good indicator that maybe more safety gear is better than less safety gear, because when you get in that moment, if you have kind of like that hyper focus, it's hard to shift, like we talked about at the beginning, maybe back off and into a preservation mode versus like carrying as much speed into the corner, and then the chances of something going wrong if you're pushing really hard and always trying to take the car to the limits of either your skills or the car's ability, that the chances of having something go wrong or unexpected happen is greater.
Sure. And the other thing is to remember, if you've got a really fast car, fast cars are harder to drive and they go faster.
They go
So,
faster. Well, and speed I think is a factor. Is a factor worth considering it as far as like, do I need the minimum or do I want to start? Do I want to look at bringing in more? I mean, anything that happens at triple digit speeds. I mean, you mentioned sliding coming off a motorcycle 100 miles an hour, you're moving at that
yeah,
point, and so you're like you said, you're sliding faster. You're going to be sliding for longer. The possibilities of something happening there is greater. With the
you
cars, it's not that different,
you have moments to reflect.
and that's a scary thing to think about.
Yeah, I remember I was racing at Mid Ohio with a Camaro, and they've got a long back straightaway, and my brakes, the bias on my brakes failed, so all of the power went to my rear brakes,
Hmm.
and I went in pretty deep. So immediately, car goes sideways. Immediately, big white smoke, flat spotted four tires. So, as I'm sideways and I'm looking at the other cars, you have a moment to reflect. Like, I've done pretty good in my life so far. I
Yep.
hope.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and I think again with cars, like you have a car that's capable of going, say, 130, 140, 150 miles an hour, and you're encapsulated. You have the car, the doors, and everything.
Right.
Well, if the car can do it, certainly it must be safe enough. Well, but if you're going to spend, like the more time you're going to spend in triple digits, especially high digit speeds, like if something should happen, I mean, tires, like it's a single point of failure. If you have a tire that goes out, it doesn't, I mean, at that point, your ability to control the car is less. The probability of you having it off goes way up. And sometimes you just never know what's going to happen. So that's the more time you spend in those triple digit speeds, then that's maybe the point where you would consider or it would be worth considering bringing in more safety gear, especially if it's a car that you're going to be it's going to be more of a dedicated track car and so forth.
Sure. No, that's a good thing. And most of the people that are, that have enough money to buy a really fast car will go the extra, for safety gear, whether
Yeah,
it's a full face helmet, whether it's putting additional belts in the car, a racing seat so that they can wear a Hans device. Yeah, I mean, especially if something bad has already happened to them. If they've
sure.
learned that lesson the hard way, then hopefully they won't have to learn it again the hard way.
Right. Now, and the thing that you have to keep in mind making that decision to bring in the belts and stuff is that now, because 4-point belts are not allowed, and I believe harness bars are pretty much not allowed either, which is a way to bring in a harness but not put in a cage. I
Okay.
believe that most tracks don't allow that.
I hadn't heard that, but if that's what you've heard, okay.
Well, and I guess if you're going to look at bringing in belts, find out about harness bars.
Sure.
If your track or the organized body allows them. I think that the difficulty there is that the standards for a harness bar, like there's not really a standard for this bar.
Right.
Typically, they bolt in the over the shoulder belt
Right.
location and then just go across.
Right.
But there's not a standard for like bar thickness or strength.
Right.
If you remove the factory belts, which are certified, and then you put in a harness bar that is not certified, you might be in a little bit more tenuous situation than before. But the thing of it is that now when you bring in those belts, you've got to do it for both sides because that equal protection rule, just to ensure if you have an accident, you're going to be as well protected as your passenger, be it an instructor or somebody else. So
Well,
that
and
makes sense.
you can also consult people that make roll cages if you want to see, okay, this is what I've got as a harness bar. Is it sufficient for what I'm doing? They can tell you instantly because they do that stuff all the time.
And it is possible some of the racing classes only require a 4-point cage. So like belts, the number of points in a cage is how many connection points it has in the car. So a 4-point
Right.
would be the main hoop that would go over the heads of the driver and the passenger, but then it
Right.
just goes to the back of the car.
Right.
So it's easier and less expensive to install. And then once you have that 4-point cage, then you can properly install whatever belts you need.
Right. And then of course for the racing we do, it's 8 points of contact.
Yeah.
You're through the dash, you're behind. So it's a really, really good cage.
Yeah. And putting a cage in, it's an investment. I mean, it's going to cost a bit of money. It lets you properly install the safety gear. So it's one of those things that as you start thinking in that direction, those are the things to weigh. And the big thing is to find out the tracks you're going to be going to, what their requirements are,
Right.
and the organizing bodies that you're driving at the track with, be it SCCA, NASA, etc. What are their requirements for safety?
And all that information is in the rule book of that particular organization. And after you read it, it may or may not make sense. Call somebody from that organization, give me a call, run it by them just to make sure before you spend the money and you didn't do it properly and now you have to redo it.
Right. Or you spent the money, you go to your event, and you find out that, well, if I was running just an open track day or with this organization, it would be fine. But I want to compete with this organization and it's not okay. I have to do
Right.
a couple extra things.
Right.
Yeah. What is your thoughts or recommendation point for just something as simple as a driving suit, a fireproof driving suit, and possibly gloves or shoes for
Um, I would suggest around here, wine country has really got the best selection of stuff in stock. Um, Grant down there has always been very helpful. In any of the people, I know just about everybody down there. If you want to try it on, especially helmets, especially fire suits, even shoes,
yep,
it's really important that in addition to the protection, that it be as comfortable as possible, and
100%.
especially helmets. Everybody has a different style head, and you can try on 3 different brands of helmets and nothing will fit correctly. And
Yep.
then you try on the fourth and it feels like, oh, well, I've worn this helmet all my life. It feels like a glove.
That
So
is, yeah, that is a great point.
yeah, it's really important, because if you get a helmet that's too tight
If,
and mid
yeah,
race you've got a pain and now that's a distraction, your risk goes up.
yeah,
So, I would spend, my students, I'll go down there with them to wine country and make sure, supervise it, and ask them the proper questions, because you're going to have that gear for a long time.
yep.
You're not going to buy fire suits and helmets, even every year.
That's a great point. And what just popped into my head is I had a guy that was in California that was looking for a recommendation for a seat. I can't remember how that came up, but what I told him is like you really need like to sit in a seat. You know, with racing seats, they have different height backs, different width,
Oh,
for
yeah.
hips and stuff. So like our Pikes Peak car in the picture over there. So our
Right.
driver Scott, he's got a seat that he loves and he fits in and it's great. And for
Right.
me, it's basically a flip of the coin whenever I get in that car if I'm going to get out, because I kind of get stuck in there and it is miserable. Um, because like just like the seat width and height that I need is not the same as what Scott needs, and I kind of get stuck in there. And so like the comfort point is a huge one that I
Right.
think is easy to overlook. Is if you don't like your helmet, if it's uncomfortable, you're right. It's going to be a distraction,
Right.
and your desire to wear it is going to be less. And that same goes for a suit,
Right.
um, a seat that you're going to be spending a lot of time sitting in. You want to
Right.
make sure that it fits and it's comfortable, because it could be a distraction, and it could take away from a lot of the enjoyment of using the car.
Well, and in the event, in the instance of the seats, I mean, if you get a seat that's not right for you, you can actually have your leg go to sleep,
Mm,
or be painful during a race. And that's really not good. And
no,
they have multiple seats there as well. You've been down there. I mean, you can sit in 10 different seats, and even if they can't find a perfect one, they can say, okay, we can order this brand an inch wider, an inch narrower, and just customize it. And that's very
yeah.
important.
Well, and the another thing, if you're going to get into an actual seat, is where the harnesses come through on the shoulders,
Right.
because different people, like you can have three people that are all 6 feet tall, but the
Sure.
length of their core could be
Yeah.
different, and which would
Also,
mean that the point where the belts come through the back would need to be different to fit properly, because they can't be below your shoulders. It has to be kind of like right above.
right.
And so like if you go to a professional shop where you can sit in the seat, make sure that it's comfortable, they're also going to be able to look at the fitment and make sure that it's correct too. And so that,
Well, and you can custom design the padding. You can put more padding at the base of the seat.
yep,
We have people that rent our cars that will put a pillow, or I kid them, it's a booster chair. It's really
right.
not, but you want to get them as comfortable as possible, and so the belts are laying correctly, so that in the event of an impact, they're gonna do the most good.
Yep, exactly. And that fitment, the fitment being correct,
Right.
is important for them to be able to do that job. Yeah, be
And
it a helmet or a
same.
seat.
Right. And same thing with the steering wheel. I've had cars that the steering wheel, I thought I was a bus driver. I mean, the steering wheel was huge,
Mhm.
and the car had power steering. So,
Right.
they also have steering wheels down there, and try them on. See, okay, if that's a little big, all right, there we go. That
Mhm.
works great.
Yeah. It's important to have the right gear, and it's important that it actually fits so it can do its job right. And that's
Right.
that's something that we it's the internet age. We all fall into this trap of like, oh, I just need a race suit. I'll just click this button and I'll have it. I need a helmet. I'll just click this button. It's going to be fine. Like this is
Right.
one of those things where like it really does. It is important to actually put it on, fit it, make sure that it fits properly. Yeah.
Spend the extra time, spend a little extra money so that it feels great.
Yep.
It's like I said, you're going to have it for a long time.
Yep. And I would say, like, even if you're a beginning enthusiast and you're just doing track days, you're just starting to spend a little bit more time at the track. I mean, getting a good driving suit that has a decent fire protection rating and maybe some fireproof gloves with an automotive certified helmet. I mean, those are all things that are just good to have. And again, you just probably nothing's going to happen, but you never know.
Right.
And to have it, it's easier to have it and not need it than the other way around. Because because
That's
you're on your
right.
motorcycle starting to fall over, that's not the time to like start looking around for a good jacket or a good helmet or something.
When I got my 2010 Grand Sport Corvette, I bought it brand new, sent it out to Phoenix Performance to get fixed up. Wasn't a scratch on it. I did the runoffs at a Road America, and that was the year that the guy up front missed a shift, and my car got hit at all four corners.
Oof.
My brand new, beautiful car. Now, the good news is I was totally unscathed. I didn't have
Yeah,
a scratch, and I got hit multiple times.
yeah.
My wallet was not unscathed, but
It also got hit multiple times.
yes, it did.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and if you're a motorsport enthusiast, you're probably watching motorsports, and almost any motorsport that you're watching now, if there is an incident that occurs, more now than ever before previously, usually there's it's less significant. Usually, the people are getting out of the cars and
Oh yeah,
are in good shape, and a lot of that, I mean, it's all trickle down, like from the highest level to the most entry level of motorsports, as organizing bodies figure out what is safer or how you can build a cage safer, or like having a fire suppression system on the car, what
sure.
increases the safe survivability of an incident, or increases the safety for the car. That's where this all comes from, and that's where all these standards have come from. So as you're watching motorsports and you're seeing like it's motorsports used to be a little bit more perilous. Like when you're like if you go back and watch any of the Formula One races from the 80s or the 90s, like
Oh yeah.
you start to watch like a
20,
few of those races, and it's like
25% of the drivers.
there's some scary stuff that used to happen, and it doesn't happen anymore. And maybe
Right.
that's just something to keep in mind, is like the reason for it is because the safety has gotten so much better.
Right.
And so, but you've got to remember as you're watching this and you're seeing like, wow, look at that car that flipped, six ways from Sunday, and then the guy just walked out and wasn't injured. Well, it's because the safety standards are better, but that's why you have to follow those safety standards to have that level of protection as well.
Right. And it's, I can't imagine that's even before my time. Most of the people in Formula One that died, it was because of fire.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I'm not saying go back and watch those things just for that, but it's, that's one other thing that maybe we need to kind of remind ourselves of, is that, because you're not, most of these instances, the drivers are walking away. It's because they have a very high degree of safety, and that's from the gear and from the build of the car.
Right.
But that doesn't, unless you have that same equipment in your car, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have the same degree of safety built into the cars. Cars
Correct.
obviously have gotten better too. I mean, the impact protection that just a ready off the showroom floor car offers now in 2023 compared to even 5 or 10 years ago is
Right.
greater, certainly. But
Right.
when you start talking about motorsports, the built-in protection is not. It's still not the same as if you had, the 6-point harness, the Hans device, a proper cage. Like there's still a difference there.
Well, and the older cars, they'd hit a brick wall and the car wouldn't be that damaged, but the driver would probably die.
Yeah.
Whereas now you get into a car and the car is just totally destroyed. It takes all the energy, and the driver typically will get out unscathed. They're very, not
Yeah.
hurt very badly at all.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe just as we're winding it down here, that the age of the car might be something to consider too. Like if you're doing vintage racing, or the car that you want to take to the track is your favorite car from like the 80s or the 90s, before they really had very well developed and implemented crumple zones and stuff in the chassis. Like
Right.
that's where maybe like bringing in a cage so that you're bringing in that really high level of protection to this car that maybe didn't have it from the factory. That's where that might be
Well, and
another advantage.
in vintage racing, you're still going to be required to have the roll cage, the racing
Sure.
seat, the belts, the fire suit, all that. So even if the car isn't quite as good, you're still going to be protected with all of the other safety requirements.
Right. Right. Well, so we've touched on a lot of stuff. I feel like we've covered it, a lot of good topics here. Is there anything else you think of or can think of that maybe we should touch on before we wind it down?
Well, you're not going to get out of a conversation with me without talking about training.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, so many people that I train, and this is on the street as well, they don't know how to stop in the shortest distance. They don't know what to do in the event of a brake failure, throttle stick, two-way stop where you can't see. So get good training so that, if you knew what the top drivers in the world did that either never had accidents on the road ever or championship winning race car drivers, if you were trained to do that same technique, you would be better, safer, So don't forget training.
Yeah. And I mean, it's what it is it's kind of like when you're talking about the awareness plan, plan A, plan B, plan C, like drive perfectly, hit all your marks, plan A. Plan B is, okay, I missed the turn in, but I'm still going to hit my exit.
Right. Your
When you,
apex.
yeah, or sorry, apex. When you know what that is, and when you can actually like, how do you know if you've missed your turn in points?
Right.
And then the level of control of the car that you have. The more you drive, the more instruction you get, the more understanding you have of your ability to control the car as a driver, your ability to use the steering, the throttle, the brakes to use the car as it can be, and
and to interact with the car, to feel.
Right.
The difference between an average driver and a world champion driver is typically when they feel something is amiss. The world champion driver feels it in the first nanosecond. The average driver feels it after 2 seconds.
Right. And maybe would you agree also, like when something is amiss, what ability or controls they have at their ability to still control the car or correct the car
Correct.
versus like somebody that doesn't have a lot of experience. You might think you're a passenger long before, like there may be things you can do that you're not aware of.
Right. And that's being familiar with the car and being trained to do it at the reflexive level. A lot of people think that intellectual knowledge transfer is top level training, and
Right.
it's not.
It's the reflex, the subconscious
Sure.
ability to react versus having to think things through.
Right.
Yeah, it's like we've talked about uh, hitting a fastball, or like if you look at the physics of hitting a fastball, the time from when it leaves the pitcher's hand until it's over home plate, and the time and the speed that it's going, it should be impossible to hit a fastball, but major league players can do it because they've trained, they've practiced so much that
Right.
there's basically a natural reflex that they have honed to be able to do that. And to a certain extent, that there's a similarity there with driving, where like as you spend more time in the seat, as you get more familiar with your controls and your abilities and get good instruction, there's those control aspects that can kind of become reflex, or you have that in your toolbox.
Well, and when we're doing our street training to recognize clues of potential hazards well in advance of what the average driver would even perceive is a potentially dangerous situation.
Right. And that carries over to the track too, because if you're falling behind a car, you need to be paying attention to what you're doing, but you kind of have to have an awareness of what that car is doing too. And so
Sure.
like if something happens with that car, like you're saying, like you got a circumstance where you locked up your brakes and your tires started to smoke. Well, if I'm the car behind you, you can see that, but you see the situation happening, but then have some awareness of like, okay, what plans, what things do I now need to implement in my driving and in what I'm doing with my car to make sure that I don't get pulled into this incident? What can I do? Move into that phase.
Well, and to be trained to have backup strategies, multiple backup strategies. If this happens, I do this. If this happens, I do that. And have that at the reflexive level. That is the difference between the top drivers and the drivers that something always seems to happen with them.
Right, right. And even as you're just getting into, if you're exploring going at the track and driving at speed for the first time or handful of times, like those reflexes and that kind of level of awareness, that's something that you're going to have to develop.
Right.
Like that's not something that you could have been driving on the street for 40 years. And this is a different level of awareness. Hopefully you have some of it, but it is different than what you might have just from driving at the street.
Well, and like I always say, practice makes permanence.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect practice makes perfect.
Yeah. So that's one of the points. That's kind of why I wanted to start with the awareness plan. And it's the knowledge that there are some things that you can do proactively to increase your skill set, and with the choices that you make as far as the gear that you have, the gear that you've installed in the car, and the gear that you're always wearing in the car on track, but also your training and your proficiency level with driving that have an effect on your safety.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point to end on. I think that's probably as good a place as we can come to. I think we've covered it all. If you've got any questions, you're all obviously welcome to leave them in the comments below, but you're also welcome to reach out to Mike at Go For It Services. Mike has got a wealth of experience that can probably answer any question that you might have as far as training or what safety gear you might need. So, Mike, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for suggesting this topic. Honestly, it's something where, again, it's so easy to lose sight of the importance of safety, and so I think it was a really good conversation to have.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to talk to you, John.
Yes, sir. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for watching. Hopefully, this was helpful. And until next time, as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.